Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank everyone who has contributed to this debate this afternoon. I'll thank also some who haven't had the opportunity in this afternoon's debate to express their opinion on record. I'll name Jenny Rathbone, of course, who's one who signed this motion and who is here in the chamber supporting this 100%. This motion before us. And could I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for his positive response to the specific call that's being made by us today. But my thanks goes mainly to the individuals and the families that have lived with this injustice for so long, and the families of those who have lost their lives, and for their dignity and their resilience in pressing on us to ensure that they hopefully will be able to have justice.
Have told us about the real experiences of constituents, of friends, of family members even, have recounted heart-wrenching experiences that highlight to us why it is that we are demanding this action. Julie Morgan eloquently put the case for an inquiry. Mark Isherwood described the scale UK-wide of this tragedy, this scandal, and the inadequacies of the compensation scheme. Di Rees reminded us of the stigma that runs alongside the ill health. Di Lloyd reminded us that it's 16 years since this Assembly discussed this very issue, and still we await action. And Hevin David summed up our intention quite simply today as a call for action. That call is a very simple call. Mae'r hyn dan ni'n ei ofyn.
And what we're demanding this afternoon is very simple indeed. As we've heard, 283 people in Wales were infected with hepatitis C or HIV because of contaminated blood in the 70s and 80s. 70 of those have now passed away. Their names are once again on the screens around this chamber. And behind every name there is an individual who had to live a life suffering both illness and stigma through no fault of their own. And behind every name there is also a family who have had to grieve through no fault of their own. In the cross-party group on contaminated blood, we've heard some powerful descriptions of the experiences of victims and their family, not only the physical impacts of the infections, but also the psychological impacts on them, their families and friends, about the prejudice of people when they told them that they had HIV or hepatitis C, and the guilt felt by many of them who had infected husbands, wives, or even babies unbeknown to them. And because of that, factors such as these, many have decided to suffer in silence. But to intensify that suffering, government after government has also chosen to remain silent and to refuse to get to the heart of exactly what went wrong and why. Victims and their families deserve to know, and they deserve justice. One of the outcomes of this absence of answers, the absence of a perception of what went wrong, is the striking problem, as we've heard from many members, in terms of the compensation package provided. These demands for an inquiry today don't replace calls for improved compensation packages for victims, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary hears my comments on that, and certainly a public inquiry, a full public inquiry, shouldn't be any reason for the government to come to a just settlement for those people who have suffered.
With me that what is needed is a full and effective public inquiry, similar to the one that Charles Hendry conducted into the tidal lagoon, not one that takes 6 years and comes up with one limp recommendation as what happened in Scotland. We need a full public inquiry so that we know that the NHS is a learning organisation and has learnt from the dreadful mistakes that were made.
I'm grateful to the member for making that intervention, and she's absolutely right, of course, that what we want is a complete inquiry. We've waited long enough to get the answers to the questions that we ask, and I'm grateful that that point has been made. Inquiries that we have seen in Scotland have been useful in terms of the compensation structure, but it's not enough in itself. And dilyn ymchwiliad Penrose.
Following the Penrose inquiry in Scotland in 2005, the SNP government did introduce an improved, fairer system of financial support because they believed that the Scottish government had a moral responsibility to do that. Let us here too support demands for an inquiry, but a fuller public inquiry as part of the steps towards taking full support to victims in Wales and their families too. Let me quote a constituent of mine whose wife, Jennifer, is suffering hepatitis C. She was infected in the 70s, and this is what he said.
She has become ill. She's been unable to do most of the things she did before. In the early days, she was so debilitated that she could not cook, could walk only a short distance, could not drive, found it difficult to understand basic things. She needed help washing and dressing. She has improved, slowly, but 12 years later, she still suffers from chronic fatigue, usually spending most afternoons asleep. She cannot cope with day-to-day housework and cooking, but she tries to do some, often making mistakes. Crucially, he says, in her words, she never has a good day, just bad or very bad. I've met Jennifer and her husband on a number of occasions. I've been struck by their dignity. Dignity in the face of what they have had to endure in terms of their health and in the face of an unjust compensation structure and of too many unanswered questions. 70 of the 283 contaminated in Wales are no longer with us. You've seen their names in the chamber today. We owe it to them, and we owe it to all those still living with the consequences of the contaminated blood scandal to seek answers once and for all. For justice, support today's motion.